this video on the Russian Revolution, we'll talk about the March and October revolutions themselves. We'll look at the Russian Civil War that followed, and then the rise of Vladimir Lenin and the USSR. Last time we left off by talking about the struggles that the government had. We talked about how World War I represented a terrible threat to Russia, and the casualties were mounting. We talked about how the Tsar had taken over military command at the front, leaving the government in the hands of his wife, who, in the midst of a terrible war against Germany, she herself was born in Germany, and that also fueled some people's mistrust of her. But the government was holding on until the Russian military could no longer be counted upon. You had bread riots and strikes and things, and when troops were ordered to put them down, they began to refuse to fire on civilians. Then the troops refused to fight. This is happening at the same time as the Nivelle offensive and the French mutinies are happening on the Western Front. You have troops mutinying under the Russian military as well. At one point, the Tsar finally decides to return to Petersburg, to return to run his government, but his train is stopped and blocked by troops that are in revolt against their commanders. They take another route, they get stopped again. At one point, they recognize that if those men knew the Tsar was in there, his life might be in danger. And so, faced with what he thought was no other alternative, Tsar Nicholas abdicates both for himself and for his son who had hemophilia, the blood disease that had almost no treatment to it. He feared for his son's life and safety, that others who wanted the Tsar to come back to power might try to rally around his son and say that although the Tsar had abdicated, they would use his son as a figurehead for future counter-revolutionary activity, and so he made that decision. The Tsar abdicating immediately triggers what we call the March or February Revolution. It's March, February, and October, November are the two names of these months the revolutions happen, because they changed the calendar from what their old calendar was to our current calendar. So I'm kind of mixing the two there, but they're commonly known by those months, especially the Red October Revolution in Russia. So first, in February, March, you had the Tsar abdicated, and in fact, in another reference to our ancient history of Julius Caesar, if we remember, what brought him down was that he was killed by the other senators on the Ides of March in the new calendar. So actually in the Russian calendar they didn't consider it this, but it also happened to be the 15th of March that the Tsar, who takes his name from Caesar, happened to be forced to abdicate. So the Tsar's abdication essentially forces this March Revolution, which is led by the Duma, the democratic leaders in Russia, under Alexander Kerensky, and they form a provisional or temporary government of Russia. They make the unpopular decision to continue the war. They believe that this is, the big one, the revolution is coming, the Americans are coming, and that Russia will be able to hang on against Germany, and that this is the change that Russia needs, but see the above problems of World War I. Democracy doesn't fill bellies or create factories or supplies, and so Russia is still in a world of pain as Germany continues to pour into Russia in World War I. This brings about just 6 months later, after the failed Kerensky offensive and the continuation of World War I and the Russian participation in it, you have a second revolution just 6 months later that is effectively a Bolshevik coup. Who are the Bolsheviks? Bolshevik, a name chosen by their leader, Vladimir Lenin. The term literally means majority. The Bolsheviks are also known as the Red Russians. We'll bring this up again in just a moment. They are essentially the violent, revolutionary, Marxist communists of Russia. Among their leaders include their chief leader, Vladimir Lenin, one of his close allies, Leon Trotsky, who will be most famous for being one to oversee war communism during the Civil War, and a man who was not a key leader, was a younger cohort, but will become much more famous later as the totalitarian dictator of communist Russia, who is Joseph Stalin, who will later claim to have played a much larger role early on, even though really Lenin and Trotsky were the two much bigger leaders at the time, and Stalin in the early days was a minor player. He would later come to be the dictator of all of Russia, the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks wanted to place all power, so they said, into the Soviets. A Soviet is merely a council of workers, kind of a glorified and more communist version of like a union. And so these worker councils were a little democratic, and this was where they had the slogan, all power to the Soviets. It was one of their goals, that these worker councils would make decisions rather than the rich, the noble, the powerful, the czar, that councils of ordinary people, workers and peasants, would have power and say. Lenin himself, where did he come from? He lived in Russia, but he'd also lived in exile for quite some time. He was actually captured in Switzerland by the Swiss, who didn't want a known revolutionary living in their country during World War I. They handed him over to the Germans. The Germans, knowing that Lenin wanted to start a revolution against the government, put him on a sealed train and sent him back to Russia, with the knowledge that he would be a destabilizing force in Russia, and sure enough it worked, using the famous slogan, land, peace, bread, meaning that they would take land and in theory distribute it from the nobles, the boyars, the large landowning nobility of Russia, and distribute it to the peasants. Peace, they would end World War I, and bread, they would forcibly and socialistically take food produced by farmers, peasants, the agricultural workers, and forcibly send it to the cities to end some of the food shortages. Essentially, he seized power in a coup d'etat, much as Napoleon did, and much as the Terror and Robespierre did. There were those who called him Robespierre, making an analogy to the French Revolution between Robespierre and Vladimir Lenin. What they did was they planned a coup. One night they planned, and they sent people with guns to the telegraph station in Petersburg, the capital. They seized control of a cruiser, a warship in the harbor, the Aurora. A warship called the Aurora, sitting just outside, just offshore. They seized the railroads, the telegraphs, the police station, and in the middle of the night they seized a few key areas. And if the government had one division, maybe one regiment, they could have cleared out these Bolsheviks who just seized control of the capital, but they threatened civil war right in the streets of the capital. The government feared that even though they were in favor of democracy, that too many of the people were swayed by this promise of land, of peace, of bread, especially of peace. That Lenin and the Bolsheviks were too popular, the people were with them, and so with just one night seizing control of several government buildings in the capital and several important private buildings, the government gave way and fell and gave over power to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. However, that doesn't mean that everyone in Russia gave up. This begins the process of the Russian Civil War. It's a tragic irony that the thing that crippled Russia was World War I, and in order to pull out of it, they're faced with an even more devastating civil war, Russians against Russians. And they, as they say, the Red Russians against the White Russians. Reds were the Bolsheviks, the violent communist revolutionaries, the die-hard Marxists led by Lenin, called the Bolsheviks or the Reds. Whites referred to all the anti-Bolsheviks. This even included more moderate Russian socialists, Marxists, called the Mensheviks, who, this would be closer to what we'd studied previously, such as like Fabian socialism, more moderate, gradual socialists, as opposed to the diehard Marxist revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks. The white Russians included Mensheviks, who were socialists themselves, included the monarchists, those who wanted the Tsar or Tsarevich back, people who opposed communism, those who were simply capitalists, the Democrats, not the political party, but the political position of democracy, of Republican form of government, and even the former Allied powers send troops, France, Britain, the United States, send small expeditionary forces to Russia in order to try to prevent the Red Russian takeover, but they ultimately fail. At one point, a white Russian army is nearing the place that the Romanov family is being held, and rather than let the white army recapture the Romanovs and use them as figureheads of the anti-Bolshevik armies, they have them all killed and kill the Tsar, the Tsarina, his wife, and all of their children to prevent, to basically try to end the dynasty and prevent them from coming back. The Civil War brought even more devastation to Russia, which was terrible after already World War I was so bad. A terrible war of Russian against Russian with as much forced conscription, even more than the draft of World War I. You had troops on the Red Army. The Bolsheviks would go into a town. They would take women and children hostage and force the men into the army under the threat that they would kill the women and children, and they would take all the men, young, old, and take almost all of the young and old men into the Red Army in order to secure their political compliance with communism. You saw widespread famine or food shortages. You saw a huge drop in land use, nearly a third of it not even being in use. But despite use of land falling by a third, the yield of that the food produced dropped to only a third of what had been produced before. The resulting effect was to implement war communism during the period of the Russian Civil War. War communism is a form of brutal socialism sort of implemented by Leon Trotsky, intended to win the war at all costs. So they're going to implement socialism quickly, hastily, brutally, through whatever means necessary in order to defeat those who oppose Bolshevism. So they take over all the industries. They take over all international trade. They take over the railroads. They demand labor duty. They forbid strikes. They implement strict rationing, harsh requisition policies, and they distribute it to the cities. So anything beyond your bare minimum of food that a peasant would produce, they were required to give it over to a central authority who would then share it among the cities equally to try to ease the terrible starvation they were facing in the cities. Ultimately, the Reds, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, win the Russian Civil War with a terrible, terrible cost. 10 million casualties lost in the Russian Civil War, almost all civilians, which is so shocking since World War I had already been so devastating, and yet only 7 million were lost in World War I in Russia, and yet they lost 10 million to this even worse civil war. This civil war left 7 million children as street children, orphans, and it leaves the brutal regime victorious, and yet production terribly fell. The industry was down to a mere 10% of what it was. The all-important heavy industry down to only 20%. Coal was cut, and food was cut by half. Next time, we'll pick up with the ways that Lenin ruled over this new Soviet Union. Thanks for watching.